History usually begins with writing, clay tablets pressed with symbols, stone carved with names, ink fixed to paper. That moment when marks stopped fading and memory became permanent is where most history books open their first page. Everything before it is pushed into a single vague word: prehistory, a time before records, before cities, before civilization, as if nothing truly human had happened yet. But this assumption hides a much deeper problem. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Bodies like ours, brains like ours, the same capacity for language, emotion, creativity, and imagination. And yet almost everything we call history covers only the last 5,000 years. That is less than 2% of our existence. The remaining 98% is treated as a quiet prelude, a blur, a waiting room before the real story began. This is not because nothing happened, it is because almost nothing was written down. Writing is a powerful filter. It decides what survives and what disappears. When we let writing define history, we allow everything without it to fade into silence. Entire worlds collapse into a footnote simply because they left no ink behind. But silence does not mean absence. For most of our time on this planet, humans lived without cities, without farms, without kings, and without records. They left behind few durable traces: stone tools, bones, charcoal, faint pigments on cave walls. And yet during that vast stretch of time, people were living full lives. They were raising children, solving problems, adapting to brutal climates, forming social bonds, making art, telling stories, staring into the night sky and wondering what it meant. They were not waiting to become human, they already were. Before we go any further, feel free to let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I genuinely enjoy reading those messages. There is something quietly fascinating about seeing these questions travel across different places, time zones, and lives. And as always, the images you see here are simply meant to offer atmosphere and context. Thank you for being here and for supporting this journey. The idea that humanity began with civilization is comforting. It gives us a clean origin point, a sense of progress, a straight line from ignorance to knowledge. But the deeper we look, the more that line dissolves. What replaces it is not chaos, but something far more unsettling. A long-forgotten continuity of human experience that stretches far beyond what history remembers. The people who lived 200,000 years ago were not primitive versions of us. They were not halfway formed. They were not missing something essential. If you could meet one of them face to face, you would not see a creature on the edge of humanity. You would see someone who looks like you, someone who could recognize your expressions, your fear, your joy, your grief. Place them in modern clothing, and they could walk through a city unnoticed. Their brains were the same size as yours. Their neural architecture followed the same patterns. Given time and exposure, they could learn language, mathematics, technology, not because they were exceptional, but because they were already human. So the question is not when did humans become intelligent? The question is why we forgot that they already were. For a very long time, knowledge did not live on paper. It lived in people, in memory, in repetition, in stories passed from one voice to another, in skills learned through observation and practice, in rituals that encoded meaning without explanation. This kind of knowledge does not fossilize easily. It vanishes when the last person who carries it is gone. Time erases wood and fiber. Water swallows coastlines. Ice grinds landscapes flat. And when the last ice age ended, sea levels rose hundreds of feet. Entire coastal worlds disappeared beneath the ocean. Places where humans may have lived for tens of thousands of years are now unreachable. Their stories dissolved with them. What remains is a distorted picture, one that makes early humanity appear sparse, simple, and quiet, But this is an illusion created by preservation, not by reality. If a future civilization were to study our time only through plastic and stone, they would miss most of what defines us. Our music, our conversations, our beliefs, our fears, our relationships. They might assume we lived shallow lives surrounded by objects without understanding the systems of meaning that once animated them. That is the mistake we risk making about our own past. History remembers monuments because they endure. It remembers cities because they leave ruins. It remembers rulers because they carved their names into stone. But for most of human existence, there was nothing to carve and nowhere permanent to build. People moved with seasons. They adapted to changing environments. They carried their knowledge with them. This way of living does not announce itself loudly to the future. It whispers, and whispers are easy to miss. There is another reason this long human story feels distant. It challenges the narrative of progress we rely on to understand ourselves. If humans were already complex long before civilization, then modern society is not the source of our intelligence or creativity. It is simply one expression of it. A recent one, powerful but not inevitable. That realization can feel uncomfortable. It suggests that cities are not the culmination of humanity, but a detour. That writing did not create thought but captured only a fraction of what already existed. That meaning, art and belonging may have thrived in forms we no longer recognize. It also forces us to confront a deeper truth. History did not begin when humans became interesting. It began when memory learned how to survive death. Everything before that moment was not empty. It was simply fragile. In the long night before history, there were no archives. There were no dates. There were no names carved into stone. But there were people sitting around fires telling stories that mattered enough to remember. There were children learning how to read landscapes the way we read screens. There were elders holding knowledge that could not be written but had to be lived. This is where our story truly begins. Not with cities, not with writing, but with the question history never learned to ask. Were we already human long before history learned to remember us? Pause here. Let that question settle, because everything that follows is an attempt to answer it. Imagine meeting someone who lived 300,000 years ago. Not a rough sketch from a textbook, not a half-formed figure crouched in shadows. A real person, standing upright, looking back at you with eyes that recognize curiosity and caution in the same way yours do. They would not look strange. Their height would fall within modern ranges. Their shoulders, hips and limbs would move with the same balance and efficiency. Their skull would be rounded, their face flatter than earlier human species, their chin distinct, the unmistakable signature of our own anatomy. This is not speculation. It is what the bones show us. The oldest known fossils of anatomically modern humans were discovered in North Africa at a site called Jebel Irhoud. When they were first uncovered, researchers assumed they belonged neatly within the familiar timeline. 200,000 years old perhaps, a comfortable distance from the present. But the dates came back older, much older, over 300,000 years. That single discovery forced a quiet revision of everything we thought we knew. Modern humans did not appear suddenly near the end of prehistory. They emerged deep within it, and they did not emerge in one isolated place. Similar remains began appearing across Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa. Different regions connected by movement and gene flow, not a single birthplace but a network. From the very beginning, our species was widespread, connected and adaptable. And inside those skulls was something even more striking. Brains the same size as ours, the same volume, the same overall structure, the same regions associated with language, memory, emotion and imagination. There is no missing piece, no underdeveloped lobe, no sign that something essential had not yet formed. biologically speaking, they were already us. This creates a paradox that still unsettles researchers today. If humans looked like us and thought like us so early, why does the archaeological record remain so quiet for so long? Why do the first 100,000 years of our existence appear almost invisible? For a long time, the answer seemed obvious. They had modern bodies but not modern minds. Perhaps intelligence came later. Perhaps symbolic thought emerged slowly. Perhaps something changed in the brain long after the body had finished evolving. But this explanation has grown weaker with every new discovery. The problem is not that early humans lacked intelligence. The problem is that intelligence does not fossilize. Stone tools from 300,000 years ago already show planning and precision. Making them required understanding angles, force and material properties. It required the ability to imagine a final form before it existed. It required teaching and learning across generations. These are not the behaviors of a mind still waking up, but tools alone do not tell us how people thought about themselves. They do not reveal whether someone wondered about the future or reflected on the past. They do not show whether a person felt awe, fear, or meaning when looking at the world around them. For those clues, we rely on traces of behavior that rarely survive. Pigments, decorations, burials, objects made not just to function but to signify. And here again, the timeline stretches deeper than we once believed. Pieces of ochre scraped and ground with care. Shells collected far from the sea and pierced for stringing. Patterns carved into stone that serve no obvious practical purpose. These signs appear tens of thousands of years earlier than expected. They appear quietly, scattered, easy to dismiss. But taken together, they suggest something important. The capacity for symbolic thought did not suddenly ignite. It was already present, waiting for conditions that allowed it to leave marks behind. Early humans lived in small groups spread across vast landscapes. Population density was low. Innovation travelled slowly. Many ideas may have emerged and disappeared within a single group, leaving no trace beyond memory. This does not mean those ideas were simple. It means they were fragile. A single drought, a changing climate, a failed generation, and entire traditions could vanish. Not because they were weak, but because they lived only in people. If intelligence had a voice, it would sound like this. We were thinking long before we were recorded. The absence of evidence has often been mistaken for evidence of absence. But when we look at the bodies and brains of early humans, that mistake becomes harder to defend. They had everything they needed to be fully human. They had hands capable of precision, voices capable of language, minds capable of abstraction. What they lacked was permanence. Writing would one day solve that problem, but writing would also reshape how we define knowledge. What could be written would be remembered. What could not would be forgotten. And so the deep past began to look empty. But beneath that emptiness lies a simple, unsettling truth. Humanity did not begin when we learned to record ourselves. It began long before, quietly, everywhere. And whatever those early humans were thinking, feeling, and imagining did not vanish. It flowed forward, through generations, through adaptation, through survival. It lives in us now. Before we ask what they built, we must ask something more fundamental. How much of their world never left a trace at all? That is where we go next. If early humans already possessed minds capable of complexity, imagination and abstract reasoning, then the mystery shifts. The question is no longer why they were simple, but why so little of what they did remains visible to us now. Our understanding of the past is shaped almost entirely by what survives, and survival is not a neutral process. Time does not preserve what is meaningful. It preserves what is durable. Stone bone and fired clay endure, while wood fibre, skin, voice, and memory vanish. When we look back across a deep time, we are not seeing a full record of human life. We are seeing only the hardest fragments of a much softer world. For most of human existence, intelligence expressed itself through materials that were never meant to last. Shelters built from branches, hides and grasses could protect a family through seasons of cold and wind, and then disappear completely within a few years. Tools made from wood plant fibers or sinew solved complex problems and left no trace once they decayed. Knowledge lived in the body and in practice rather than in objects. It existed in how people moved across landscapes, how they recognized subtle changes in weather, how they tracked animals over long distances, and how they understood the relationships within their group. None of this fossilizes easily. Almost none of it survives long enough to be studied. This creates a profound distortion. When we reconstruct the deep past using only what remains, we mistake durability for importance. We assume that what we can still see must have mattered most, and that what is absent must never have existed. But absence often reflects environment rather than ability. Early humans spent much of their time in forests, grasslands, river valleys, and along coastlines. These are dynamic environments rich in resources and movement, but also relentless in erasing evidence. Organic materials rot quickly. Floods scatter camps. Shifting sands bury entire occupations. Over thousands of years, these processes remove nearly everything that once defined daily life. At the end of the last ice age, this erasure intensified. As global temperatures rose, ice sheets melted, and sea levels climbed hundreds of feet. Vast coastal plains where humans had lived for tens of thousands of years were slowly submerged. These were not marginal places. They were some of the richest environments on Earth, offering abundant food, predictable resources, and easy travel. Entire worlds disappeared beneath the ocean, taking with them settlements, tools, burial sites, and traditions that had endured for millennia. What we now call prehistory is missing a substantial portion of its landscape. Because of this loss, the archaeological record favours certain kinds of societies. Groups that built in stone appear more prominent than those who built with wood. Inland sites survive better than coastal ones. Sedentary settlements leave clearer traces than mobile ones. Over time, this creates the illusion that complexity emerged only when humans began to settle and build permanent structures. But permanence is not a prerequisite for intelligence. A culture that moves with the seasons and carries its knowledge internally may leave almost nothing behind while still maintaining an extraordinarily detailed understanding of the world. To understand this, it helps to consider how much of modern life would survive under similar conditions. If electricity failed and digital storage vanished, future archaeologists would find concrete, metal, and plastic, but they would miss most of what defines contemporary existence. Conversations, beliefs, music, relationships, and inner lives would leave little trace. Judged only by what endured, we too might appear shallow and incomplete. The same distortion applies to our ancestors. Early humans almost certainly experimented constantly with materials, techniques, social arrangements, and ways of understanding their environment. Some innovations spread, others remained local. Many likely appeared and disappeared multiple times across different regions. Progress did not move in a straight line. It branched, doubled back, and sometimes ended altogether. The archaeological record compresses these patterns into a simplified narrative that hides periods of creativity behind long silences. Silence in the record does not mean silence in life. Much of early human knowledge was embedded in practice rather than objects. How to locate water during a drought. How to identify a poisonous plant by subtle differences in leaf shape or smell. How to resolve conflict within a small group so cooperation could continue. These forms of intelligence are deeply sophisticated, yet almost completely invisible to us now. They depended on continuity. When that continuity broke, the knowledge vanished entirely, leaving no artifact behind. In a world without writing, forgetting was not abstract. It was dangerous. To forget a migration route or the signs of an approaching storm could mean death. As a result, early societies developed powerful systems for memory. Knowledge was encoded in stories, rituals, rhythms, and repeated actions. Meaning was not decoration. It was a tool. Information wrapped in significance was easier to remember and harder to lose. These systems were complex and effective, but they leave few marks for us to find. We can analyze a stone tool and measure its edge, but we cannot recover the stories that explained why it was shaped that way, or the social rules that governed who could use it. We can identify pigments, but we cannot hear the songs that accompanied their use. What remains are fragments detached from the living contexts that once gave them purpose. This is why the deep past can appear deceptively quiet. It is not because humans lacked imagination or intelligence. It is because most of what they created was fragile by design. Their worlds were meant to be lived in, not preserved. They relied on memory rather than monuments, and on relationships rather than records. The deep past is not empty. It is simply difficult to hear. And within that quiet, the first hints of meaning begin to surface, not as grand structures, but as subtle choices. A colour selected for reasons beyond utility. A pattern repeated without practical need. An object carried not because it is useful, but because it signifies something shared. These are the faint signals of a mind reaching beyond survival. Long before humans built cities or recorded events, they began to mark the world in quieter ways. These marks were not instructions and they were not tools. They carried meaning that could not be explained by function alone. They were symbols, and symbols change everything. A symbol is an agreement between minds. It is something physical that points beyond itself. A piece of red pigment does not heal a wound or cut meat. A shell worn around the neck does not make hunting easier. Their value lies elsewhere. They say something. They refer to ideas that exist only in thought memory and shared understanding. For a long time it was assumed that symbolic behavior appeared suddenly and late in human history. It was treated as a threshold moment when humans crossed from animal instinct into true culture. But the evidence no longer supports this clean division. Instead, symbolic behavior appears gradually and far earlier than expected, scattered across time and geography. Some of the earliest clues come in the form of ochre, red, yellow and brown mineral pigments, scraped ground and sometimes heated deliberately. These pigments appear at sites more than 100,000 years old, and in some cases much older. They are often found far from their natural sources, which means they were collected intentionally and transported over long distances. Ochre can be used for practical purposes, but its consistent preparation and repeated use suggests something more. It stains skin, hides and surfaces in ways that are visible and lasting. It transforms appearance. It marks identity. To choose colour is to care about how something looks rather than simply what it does. Shell beads offer another glimpse. In several ancient sites, shells from coastal environments have been found deep inland, pierced carefully so they could be strung or worn. These objects served no obvious survival function. They required time to collect, modify and carry. Their value lay in what they represented. Belonging, status, connection, memory. To wear such an object was to signal participation in a shared world of meaning. These were not isolated acts of decoration. They were part of a growing symbolic vocabulary that allowed humans to communicate ideas without words. Long before formal language was written, the human mind was already fluent in symbols. What makes these early symbols remarkable is not their complexity, but their intention. They show that humans were thinking beyond the immediate present. A symbol only works if others recognize it and if it retains meaning over time. This requires memory, tradition, and trust. It requires a sense of continuity that extends beyond a single moment. In this way, symbols laid the groundwork for culture long before stories were fixed in language or writing. They allowed ideas to persist even as individuals came and went. A repeated pattern, A familiar color, a worn ornament, could carry meaning across generations without explanation. The object itself became a vessel for memory. This kind of thinking suggests that early humans were not only aware of themselves as individuals, but also as members of enduring groups. Identity was no longer limited to who you were in the moment, but extended to who you belonged with and where you came from. Symbols made social bonds visible. They also reveal something about how early humans experienced the world. To create symbols is to recognize that reality has layers, that what is seen is not all that exists, that objects can stand in for ideas, and that meaning can be shared invisibly between minds. This is a profound cognitive shift, and it appears far earlier than writing agriculture or cities. Symbols also require restraint. Not everything becomes symbolic. Choices are made about what matters enough to carry meaning. This implies discussion, agreement, and perhaps even disagreement within early communities. Culture was already being negotiated. Because symbols often relied on organic materials, many of them have not survived. We see only fragments, a few beads, traces of pigment, incised lines whose purpose we can only guess. But even these fragments are enough to show that symbolic thought was not a late addition to humanity. It was present deep in our past, waiting for conditions that allowed it to endure. These early symbols did not exist in isolation. They were part of daily life, woven into movement, ritual, and interaction. They may have marked life stages, alliances, seasons, or beliefs about forces beyond the visible world. We cannot recover their full meanings, but we can recognize the kind of mind that created them. It is the same kind of mind that assigns meaning today. The same capacity to let objects carry ideas and to let shared understanding shape behavior. Before humans told stories that could be written, they told stories through things. Through colors, shapes, and repeated forms. Through choices that said this matters and remember this. Symbols came before stories because they made stories possible. They gave thought a way to persist without words, and meaning a way to survive without memory alone. And once humans began to live in a symbolic world, another question emerged quietly but inevitably. What happens to meaning when life ends? That question leads us to the first signs of philosophy. At some point, early humans began to treat death differently. Animals respond to death, but they do not linger over it. They move on because survival demands it. For humans, something changed. Death stopped being only an event and became a question. The moment a body no longer moved was no longer just the end of activity. It was the beginning of meaning. The earliest signs of this shift are subtle but unmistakable. Bodies placed carefully rather than abandoned, limbs arranged deliberately, graves dug with intention, objects laid beside the dead. These actions required time, effort, and cooperation. They offered no immediate survival benefit. They existed for reasons that went beyond practicality. To bury the dead is to acknowledge that someone mattered after they were gone. Some of the earliest known burials date back more than 100,000 years. They appear across different regions, suggesting that this was not an isolated custom, but a pattern emerging wherever humans lived long enough to form deep bonds. In some cases, bodies were sprinkled with ochre. In others, they were positioned in ways that suggest care rather than disposal. These were not accidents, they were choices. Such choices reveal a profound change in how humans understood themselves. Burial implies memory. It implies a sense of before and after. It suggests that the dead were still part of the community in some way, even if only through remembrance. This is not simply emotional attachment, it is a conceptual leap. To care for the dead is to recognize time as something that extends beyond the present moment. With that recognition comes the earliest form of philosophy, not in the form of written questions or structured arguments, but as lived inquiry. What happens when life ends? Where does a person go? What remains? These questions do not need answers to exist. The act of asking them shapes behavior. Early burial practices suggest that humans were already grappling with these ideas long before history records them. They were developing beliefs about continuity, about identity, and perhaps about forces that existed beyond what could be seen. Memory became a moral responsibility. To remember someone was to honor them. To forget them was to lose something essential. In small groups where everyone depended on one another, this responsibility was deeply felt. The dead were not strangers. They were parents, children, partners, and friends. In this context, rituals surrounding death were not abstract traditions. They were tools for emotional survival. They helped communities process loss and maintain cohesion. They created a shared framework for understanding events that could otherwise fracture a group. Objects placed with the dead may have served many purposes. They could represent tools for another journey. They could act as symbols of identity. They could simply be expressions of care. Whatever their meaning, they show that early humans were capable of imagining realities beyond the immediate physical world. This capacity to imagine the unseen is one of the defining features of humanity. It allows us to think about the future, to plan, and to create. It also allows us to confront the unknown. Death forces that confrontation. Once humans began to think about death, they began to think about time in a new way. Life was no longer an endless present, but a finite arc. This awareness likely deepened the significance of actions taken while alive. What you did mattered not only now, but in memory, in story, in how others would recall you. This shift had consequences. It strengthened social bonds. It encouraged cooperation. It may have given rise to early forms of ethics. If memory outlives the body, then reputation matters. Behavior gains weight. The earliest moral systems were likely not rules written down or enforced by authority. They were expectations woven into relationships. They lived in the knowledge that actions would be remembered and that memory carried meaning. Death also reinforced the importance of continuity across generations. Knowledge needed to be passed on not only for survival, but to honor those who came before. Stories, rituals, and skills became links between the living and the dead. In this way, culture began to stretch across time. These developments did not require cities or agriculture. They did not require writing. They required only awareness and care. They required minds capable of reflection and communities willing to invest in something beyond immediate necessity. By the time humans began to bury their dead, they had already crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer just responding to the world. They were interpreting it. This does not mean they had answers to life's deepest questions. It means they were asking them. And asking is enough to change everything. As human groups continued to spread across the world, they did not do so alone. They shared landscapes with others who looked similar, thought differently, and carried their own ways of being human. To understand what survived and what was lost, we must look at that shared world next. For much of our existence, modern humans did not walk the earth by themselves. The world was shared with others who were also human in their own ways. Different bodies, different histories, different adaptations, but minds capable of tool-making, cooperation, and learning. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovans ranged across parts of Asia, leaving traces of their presence in the genomes of living people today. Other groups such as Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi occupied their own ecological niches, adapting to environments that demanded unique solutions. This was not a world dominated by a single kind of human. It was a mosaic. For a long time, these groups were treated as evolutionary failures, dead ends on a ladder that led inevitably to us. But this view is steadily unraveling. Evidence now shows that these populations were not simply replaced. They interacted, they exchanged knowledge, they formed relationships. We carry their genes. Modern humans outside Africa retain small but significant portions of Neanderthal DNA. Some populations also carry Denisovan ancestry. These genetic traces are not curiosities. They affect immune systems, metabolism, and even responses to altitude. They are reminders that survival was not a solo achievement. It was shared. This genetic blending tells us something else as well. It tells us that these encounters were not always hostile. They required proximity, trust, and communication. They required recognition of similarity. Whatever differences existed, they were not enough to prevent connection. This challenges another assumption about early humanity, the idea that progress depends on isolation or dominance. In reality, adaptability often emerges from exchange, learning from others, integrating what works, letting go of what does not. So why did only one lineage remain? The answer is not simple, and it may never be complete. Climate played a role. Shifting environments favoured flexibility and wide social networks. Population size mattered. Larger connected groups could recover from losses more easily. Cultural transmission may have been faster among modern humans, allowing innovations to spread before they were lost. None of this implies superiority in any absolute sense. It suggests difference in strategy. Neanderthals, for example, were highly adapted to cold environments. Their bodies were robust, their tools effective. They survived extreme conditions for tens of thousands of years. Their disappearance does not mean they were less intelligent. It means they were vulnerable to rapid change. Modern humans appear to have relied more heavily on extended networks. Information moved between groups. Alliances formed across distance. When one area failed, others could support it. This kind of resilience comes not from strength alone, but from connection. In a world of uncertainty, connection matters. The coexistence of multiple human species also complicates the story of culture. Ideas did not develop in isolation. Techniques, beliefs, and practices may have crossed boundaries we can no longer see. Some traditions we attribute to modern humans may have originated elsewhere and been adopted. Others may have been lost entirely when the groups who carried them vanished. This means the deep past is not just forgotten. It is fragmented. What survived is not necessarily what was best or most meaningful. It is what managed to pass through a narrow filter of time, climate, and chance. Entire ways of being human disappeared along with the people who lived them. Yet they are not entirely gone. They persist in us in small ways, in our biology, in patterns of behavior, in instincts shaped by environments long vanished. The human story is not a clean line. It is a braided river with many channels, some of which have dried up while others continue to flow. Understanding this shared world changes how we see ourselves. It reminds us that being human has never been singular. There have always been multiple answers to what it means to live, think, and belong. We are not the beginning of humanity. We are what remains. And to understand how we lived during that long shared chapter, we need to look more closely at the life we so often dismiss as primitive. That life comes next. When we imagine early human life, we often picture hardship without pause, endless struggle, constant hunger, a fragile existence balanced on the edge of survival. This image is deeply ingrained and deeply misleading. For most of human history, people lived as hunter-gatherers, not because they had failed to invent something better, but because this way of life worked. It was flexible, resilient, and closely tuned to the rhythms of the natural world. Far from being a temporary stage on the way to civilization, it was the dominant human experience for hundreds of thousands of years. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that many hunter-gatherer societies met their basic needs with surprisingly little labour. Food was obtained through a combination of hunting, fishing, and gathering that spread risk across multiple sources. When one resource failed, others compensated. Diets were often diverse, rich in nutrients, and seasonally adjusted. In many cases, people worked fewer hours per day to secure food than early agricultural societies did. This does not mean life was easy. It means it was balanced. Hunter-gatherers developed deep knowledge of their environments. They understood animal migration patterns, plant life cycles, weather signals, and landscape features with a precision that modern societies rarely require. This knowledge was not abstract. It was practical, embodied, and constantly tested. It was passed on through observation, participation, and story rather than instruction manuals. Social structures reflected this way of life. Groups tended to be small and mobile. Hierarchies were minimal or temporary. Leadership often emerged through experience and trust rather than force. Decisions were made collectively because cooperation was essential. No one could survive alone for long. In such societies, equality was not an ideal, but a necessity. Hoarding made little sense when resources changed constantly and movement was required. Sharing ensured group survival and reinforced bonds. Reputation mattered because relationships were everything. Generosity increased security. Arrogance isolated. This social fabric had psychological consequences. Identity was not defined by possessions or status, but by belonging, competence, and contribution. A person knew who they were because they knew where they fit. Their value was visible and immediate. Many stresses that feel inevitable today were absent. There was little long-term debt, no permanent accumulation of obligation. Time was structured by natural cycles rather than schedules imposed from outside. Attention was focused on the present because the present was where life unfolded. This does not mean there was no conflict or suffering. Injury, illness, and loss were real, but the pressures were different. Stress came from environmental uncertainty rather than social abstraction. Threats were tangible and immediate rather than chronic and invisible. When we label this life primitive, we project modern assumptions backward. We assume that technology equals progress and that complexity must look like ours to count. But complexity can take many forms. A society without writing or metal can still be highly organized cognitively, socially, and emotionally. The term primitive says more about our discomfort than about their reality. From an evolutionary perspective, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle shaped the human mind far more than civilization ever has. Our brains evolved to navigate social networks, read subtle cues, respond to changing environments, and maintain attention across long stretches of quiet, punctuated by moments of intensity. These patterns are still with us. Much of modern anxiety may stem from the mismatch between this ancient wiring and contemporary life. We are surrounded by constant stimulation, abstract threats and systems too large to perceive directly. The environment our minds were shaped for no longer exists in the same form. Understanding this does not require romanticizing the past. It requires recognizing that humanity did not wait for cities to become psychologically complete. People lived full, meaningful lives long before civilization offered its solutions and its problems. The hunter-gatherer world was not a prelude to something better. It was a way of being human that worked for a very long time, and within that world humans were not only surviving, they were creating. The impulse to make something beautiful, to leave a mark, to express presence, did not begin with settled life. It emerged in caves on stone and in places never meant to last. That creative expression is where we turn next. Long before humans built monuments meant to endure, they created images meant to be seen only briefly by a few. Deep inside caves, far from daylight, figures began to appear on stone walls. Animals in motion, hands pressed against rock, lines, curves, and shapes layered carefully over time. These were not casual marks. They required planning, preparation, and intention. They required light carried into darkness and time taken away from survival tasks. They were made because someone felt compelled to make them. Some of the oldest known cave paintings date back more than 40,000 years, and new discoveries continue to push that timeline deeper. In places like Chauvet-Lascaux and Altamira, the images show remarkable sophistication. Animals are rendered with an understanding of anatomy, movement, and depth. Limbs overlap to suggest motion. Natural contours of the rock are incorporated into the composition. These artists were not experimenting blindly. They knew what they were doing. What makes these works extraordinary is not only their age, but their confidence. This does not look like the first attempt at art. It looks like a mature tradition. Techniques are refined. Conventions are repeated. There is continuity across generations. This implies that much earlier artistic expressions once existed in materials that did not survive. Wood, bark, skin, and sand would have carried images long before stone walls did. Art does not emerge suddenly. It accumulates. The hand stencils found in many caves are especially revealing. A human hand placed against the rock pigment blown around it, leaving a negative impression. It is one of the simplest artistic gestures and one of the most powerful. Someone stood in that space and chose to leave proof of presence. Not a name, not a story, just a signal that says I was here. Across tens of thousands of years and across continents, the same gesture appears. Different hands, different pigments, the same impulse. This continuity suggests something deeply human, the need to be seen, remembered, and connected across time. These artworks were not decoration for living spaces. Many were created in locations difficult to reach, requiring careful navigation through darkness, narrow passages, and uneven ground. This suggests they were part of ritual rather than daily life. The act of creating them mattered as much as the finished image. Meaning was embedded in the process. This tells us something important about early human minds. They were capable of abstraction, metaphor, and layered meaning. They could separate an image from its subject and allow it to stand in for something more. An animal painted on stone could represent a hunt, a spirit, a story, or a relationship with the unseen world. The exact meaning may be lost, but the capacity to assign it is unmistakable. Art also implies audience. Even if only a small group ever saw these images, they were made to be perceived. They were meant to communicate. This requires shared understanding and shared values. The artist trusted that others would recognize what the image referred to, even if its meaning was never spoken aloud. This is not the behavior of a mind focused only on survival. It is the behavior of a mind that reflects, interprets, and imagines. A mind that understands that reality can be represented and transformed. The materials used in early art were often ephemeral. Charcoal pigment and soft stone fade quickly. That so many examples still exist is an accident of preservation. How many more once existed in places that time erased, we can only guess. The artistic record we have is likely a small surviving fragment of a much larger creative world. Art also served as memory. In societies without writing, images could hold stories. A painted wall could act as a reference point for teaching, reminding, and transmitting knowledge. It could anchor group identity to a place. Even when people moved, they could return to these sites and reconnect with shared meaning. This suggests that early humans were already thinking across generations. They created things that would outlast a single life. Not because they sought immortality, but because they understood continuity. They understood that meaning could persist even when individuals did not. When we look at these ancient artworks, we are not witnessing the birth of creativity. We are encountering a moment when creativity became visible to us. The impulse itself is far older. The same impulse lives in us today. The desire to express, to symbolize, and to leave a trace of presence has never left the human mind. It was there long before history learned how to record it. As humans continued to refine these capacities, they were forced to test them against the most extreme conditions the planet could offer. Ice-advanced climates shifted, and survival demanded ingenuity on an unprecedented scale. That challenge reveals another side of early humanity, not as artists, but as engineers of life itself. As climates shifted and ice advanced, much of the world became a place of extremes. Vast regions grew colder, drier, and more unpredictable. For early humans, this was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a defining condition that lasted for tens of thousands of years. Survival in such an environment demanded more than strength or endurance. It demanded planning, foresight, and cooperation at a level never required before. The Ice Age was not a single frozen moment, but a long, unstable process. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Ecosystems reorganized repeatedly. Animals migrated, changed behavior, or disappeared altogether. Humans who lived through these cycles had to read subtle signals and adapt quickly. The margin for error was thin. To survive cold environments, humans developed complex technologies that rarely survive in the archaeological record. Clothing was essential. Not simple coverings, but layered garments tailored to retain heat while allowing movement. This required knowledge of materials, cutting, stitching, and insulation. It required an understanding of how the human body loses heat and how to counteract it. Such garments were likely passed down, refined, and repaired across generations. Shelter was another challenge. In some regions, humans built structures from bone hide and wood designed to withstand wind, snow, and freezing temperatures. Mammoth bone dwellings found in parts of Eurasia suggest not desperation, but planning. These were carefully arranged constructions, often reused and maintained. They indicate an understanding of structure load distribution and environmental protection. Fire became a central technology. Managing fire in cold climates is not trivial. It requires fuel selection, airflow control, and constant attention. Early humans learned to use different materials for different purposes to create long-lasting heat or quick flames as needed. Fire was not just warmth, it was light protection, cooking, and social center. Hunting large animals during the Ice Age required coordination and strategy. Megafauna were dangerous, powerful, and mobile. Taking them down involved planning, tracking, and cooperation among many individuals. Tools had to be designed for specific tasks and maintained carefully. Knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal movement, and terrain was essential. This level of organization implies communication and shared understanding. Strategies had to be explained, roles assigned, and timing coordinated. These are not simple behaviors. They reflect complex social intelligence. The Ice Age also tested human mobility. As resources shifted, groups had to move across unfamiliar landscapes. They navigated without maps, relying on memory stars, landmarks, and inherited knowledge. Routes were remembered not as abstract lines, but as sequences of experiences. Rivers, hills, and campsites became part of a mental geography passed through story and practice. Despite the harshness of the environment, humans did not merely endure. They expanded. They entered regions previously uninhabitable. They learned to live in tundra deserts and frozen plains. Each new environment required new solutions, and those solutions were often created without written instruction or centralized planning. This adaptability reveals something fundamental about early humanity. Intelligence was not concentrated in individuals or leaders. It was distributed across groups. Knowledge belonged to the collective. When one person failed, others compensated. When one generation struggled, the next inherited refined strategies. This form of intelligence leaves little trace. It does not build monuments. It builds resilience. The success of humans during the Ice Age was not an accident. It was the result of cumulative learning, careful observation, and social cooperation sustained over immense spans of time. These capacities did not emerge suddenly with civilization. They were forged under pressure long before. By the time the ice began to recede, humans had already mastered some of the most challenging conditions the planet could offer. They were prepared not just to survive change, but to move with it. That readiness would soon be tested on a global scale as humans began the greatest journey their species would ever make. At a certain point, humans began to move beyond familiar horizons, not as a sudden migration driven by desperation, but as a gradual expansion shaped by curiosity, opportunity, and adaptation. Over tens of thousands of years, people walked coastlines, crossed mountain ranges, and followed rivers into lands no human had seen before. This was not a single journey. It was many journeys layered across time. Leaving known territory requires confidence. It requires trust in shared knowledge and belief that the unknown can be understood. Early humans did not step into emptiness. They carried with them a deep inheritance of skills, stories, and strategies refined through countless generations. Movement was not reckless. It was informed. The earliest major expansion out of Africa began more than 60,000 years ago. From there, humans spread into the Middle East, across Asia, into Europe, and eventually into regions separated by vast oceans. This expansion did not follow a straight path. It responded to climate windows, shifting ecosystems, and available resources. Groups paused, adapted, and moved again. One of the most remarkable aspects of this expansion is the evidence for early seafaring. Reaching places like Australia required crossing open water. This implies the construction of watercraft planning around tides and currents, and the ability to navigate without sight of land. Such journeys demand cooperation, foresight, and trust. They are not undertaken lightly. Navigation during these migrations relied on intimate knowledge of the natural world. Stars' movements of the sun wind patterns and ocean behavior all became guides. Landmarks were memorized and encoded into stories that preserved routes across generations. Maps existed not on surfaces, but in minds. As humans entered new environments, they encountered unfamiliar plants, animals, and climates. Survival depended on learning quickly and sharing discoveries. Mistakes could be fatal. Success depended on observation, experimentation, and the ability to integrate new information without abandoning what already worked. This constant adaptation shaped human cognition. Flexibility became a strength. Curiosity was rewarded. Social learning accelerated innovation. Groups that could share information widely were more likely to thrive. Knowledge became portable, moving with people rather than remaining tied to a place. These migrations also carried culture across the planet. Symbolic practices, tools, artistic traditions, and ways of organizing life traveled with people and changed as they encountered new conditions. Over time, diversity increased, not decreased. Being human did not converge into a single pattern. It multiplied. The journey itself became part of identity. Origin stories, routes, and ancestral movements shaped how groups understood themselves. Place mattered, but so did movement. Belonging was not fixed to one location. It was woven through paths taken and remembered. By the time humans reached the far edges of continents, they had already proven something extraordinary. They were not defined by any single environment. They could live almost anywhere. This was not because they dominated nature, but because they learned to listen to it. The world before history was not static. It was dynamic, interconnected, and vast. Humans were already global long before maps or borders existed. They carried their humanity with them wherever they went. As this global presence spread, humans continued to develop ways of understanding forces larger than themselves, not just the land beneath their feet, but the sky above them, meaning expanded outward from daily survival towards something more encompassing. That expansion of awareness leads to the final turning point before history began. As humans spread across the planet, their attention did not remain fixed only on survival and movement. It turned outward and upward. The world was no longer just a landscape to be crossed or a resource to be managed. It became something alive, something responsive, something filled with presence. For early humans, the boundary between the physical and the unseen was thin. Mountains, rivers, animals, storms, and celestial bodies were not inert objects. They were active participants in a shared world. This way of understanding reality is often called animism, but the word does not fully capture its depth. It was not a belief system imposed on nature. It was a way of relating to it. In such a world, meaning was not centralized. It was everywhere. A successful hunt, a sudden illness, a change in weather all carried significance. Events were interpreted within a web of relationships that included humans, animals, ancestors, and forces beyond direct perception. To live well meant to maintain balance within this web. Ritual emerged as a way to navigate that balance. Through repeated actions, gestures, sounds, and movements, humans created moments of alignment with the world around them. These rituals were not performed to control nature, but to communicate with it. They acknowledged uncertainty and sought understanding rather than dominance. Shamans or ritual specialists likely played a key role in this process. Through altered states of consciousness, achieved by rhythm, fasting, isolation, or plant substances, they explored inner landscapes that felt as real as the outer world. These experiences were not dismissed as imagination. They were treated as sources of insight, guidance, and healing. Such practices required trust. They relied on shared frameworks of meaning that allowed individual experiences to become collective knowledge. Stories, symbols, and rituals connected the inner world of the mind with the shared reality of the group. The sky also became part of this living system. The movement of the sun, moon, and stars was observed carefully. Patterns were noticed, seasons predicted, and cycles remembered. These observations were practical, guiding migration, planting, and hunting, but they were also symbolic, linking human life to rhythms far larger than any single community. Long before formal astronomy, humans were already watching the heavens with attention and care. This awareness of cycles reinforced a sense of deep time. Life was understood not as a straight line, but as a repeating process of emergence, change, decline, and renewal. Birth and death were not opposites, but parts of a larger rhythm. In this context, places took on special significance. Certain locations became gathering points where ritual, memory, and landscape converged. These were not cities in the modern sense. They were nodes of meaning, places returned to again and again across generations. One of the most striking examples of this is a site known today as Göbekli Tepe. Built more than 11,000 years ago, it predates agriculture as we usually understand it. Massive stone pillars arranged with precision, decorated with animal reliefs and symbols, rise from the ground. The effort required to construct such a place was immense, yet it appears to have been created not as a settlement, but as a ceremonial centre. This challenges long-held assumptions. It suggests that shared belief and ritual may have drawn people together before permanent farming did. Meaning may have come first. Food production may have followed. Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated mystery. It is a visible fragment of a much older pattern. Humans were creating structured symbolic spaces long before history began to record them. These spaces organized memory, identity, and belief without writing or centralized authority. They remind us that civilization did not emerge from emptiness. It emerged from a world already rich with meaning. In a living world without history, humans did not see themselves as separate from nature. They were embedded within it. Their stories were not about conquering the world, but about belonging to it. Knowledge was relational rather than abstract. Wisdom was measured by balance rather than accumulation. This way of seeing the world did not vanish overnight. It slowly transformed as new ways of living took hold. As populations grew and movement slowed, new pressures emerged. The relationship between humans and their environment began to change. That change would reshape memory itself, and with it, history would finally begin. The shift did not happen all at once. There was no single moment when humanity stepped out of the old world and into a new one. Instead, change accumulated slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the way people lived no longer resembled what had come before. As climate stabilized after the last ice age, some groups began to stay longer in the same places. Familiar routes shortened, seasonal movement narrowed. Plants that once were gathered began to be tended. Animals once followed began to be managed. These changes were practical responses to local conditions, not grand plans for transformation. But they carried consequences. Staying in one place altered how humans related to land. Territory became fixed. Resources became owned rather than shared through movement. Surpluses appeared, and with them the need to store, protect, and control. Food could now outlast a season, and so could inequality. Agriculture did not immediately make life easier. Early farming communities often worked longer hours with less dietary diversity than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Health declined in many regions. Disease spread more easily in dense settlements. Yet agriculture persisted because it supported larger populations, and larger populations supported power. With permanence came hierarchy. Roles hardened. Leadership shifted from temporary influence to lasting authority. Decisions were no longer made only through shared agreement, but enforced through structure. Social relationships changed as some people gained control over resources others depended on. Writing emerged within this new context. Its earliest uses were not poetry or history, but accounting. Records of grain labor and ownership. Writing preserved information, but it also narrowed it. What could be written became what mattered. What could not was increasingly ignored. History was born as a record of management. This was a turning point. Memory moved from people into systems. Knowledge became externalized. Instead of being carried collectively, it was stored, controlled, and interpreted by a few. Stories that once lived in ritual and practice were replaced by texts that fixed meaning in place. This brought enormous advantages. Ideas could travel farther. Complex systems could be coordinated. Knowledge could survive individual lifetimes, but something was lost in the process. The deep continuity of lived knowledge faded. Skills that required constant practice were replaced by specialization. Relationships with land became abstract, measured in units rather than experience. Meaning shifted from participation to documentation. History began to remember us, but it remembered selectively. The world before writing did not disappear. It was overwritten. Its values, its ways of understanding time and belonging, its forms of intelligence were not destroyed but sidelined. They survived in fragments, in myth, in ritual, in instincts that no longer fit neatly into modern life. The human mind did not change as quickly as society did. Our brains remain shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of movement, cooperation, and direct engagement with the world. We are still tuned to small groups, to natural rhythms, to meaning found in relationship rather than accumulation. Many modern tensions arise from this mismatch. We live in systems that demand constant attention to abstractions while our minds seek tangible connection. We navigate environments far larger than we can perceive, and responsibilities that extend beyond direct experience. Understanding this does not mean rejecting civilization. It means seeing it clearly. Civilization is not the fulfillment of humanity. It is one phase among many. A powerful one, but not the only way humans have lived well. If this exploration resonated with you, you are welcome to support the channel by liking the video, sharing it with someone who might enjoy these questions, or subscribing to continue these journeys together. Your support helps these long and quiet stories find their way to others who are listening for them. When history began, it gained the ability to remember across vast distances and long spans of time, but it also forgot how much had already been lived. The long ages before writing were not a blank slate. They were the foundation. We were already human long before history learned to remember us. The people of that deep past were not waiting to become something else. They were thinking, feeling, creating, and belonging in ways that shaped everything that followed. Their world does not exist anymore, but its imprint remains in us. To remember that is not to look backward with nostalgia. It is to recognize the full scope of what it means to be human. History tells one story, our deeper past tells another, and between them lies a question that still matters now.